What if I told you that the economic system promising you the most freedom is actually the one making you sick? What if the very structure designed to create opportunity has become the primary generator of chronic anxiety in modern society? Right now, as you listen to this, millions of people are lying awake at night, their minds racing with financial worries, career uncertainty, and the relentless pressure to compete in a system that promises success but delivers psychological torment to the vast majority. This isn't an accident. This isn't a side effect. This is a feature of the system working exactly as designed. The ideas we're about to explore aren't conspiracy theories or political rhetoric. They're backed by decades of psychological research, economic analysis, and the lived experience of entire generations who have watched the promise of prosperity transform into an epidemic of mental health crisis. Studies from Harvard School of Public Health show that people living in highly competitive, market-driven societies experience anxiety disorders at rates nearly double those in more socially supportive economic systems. Research from Stanford University demonstrates that chronic economic uncertainty literally rewires our brains, creating permanent states of hypervigilance and stress. The American Psychological Association has documented a direct correlation between the implementation of free market policy and rising rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide across multiple countries. This isn't about politics. This is about understanding how a specific set of economic ideas, championed most notably by Milton, Friedman, and the Chicago School of Economics, has created a psychological landscape where anxiety isn't just common, it's inevitable, where the pursuit of opportunity has become a source of chronic mental suffering, where the promise of choice has delivered only the illusion of control while systematically undermining the very foundations of psychological well-being. Today, I'm going to reveal 7 specific mechanisms through which our economic system transforms the promise of opportunity into engines of anxiety. 7 ways that the theories designed to liberate human potential have instead created the largest experiment in mass psychological manipulation in human history. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand not just why you feel anxious, but how that anxiety serves the system's need for compliant, productive, and perpetually striving workers. The first mechanism we need to understand is what I call the perpetual uncertainty engine. Milton Friedman built his entire economic philosophy on the idea that uncertainty and competition would drive innovation and create optimal outcomes for everyone. He argued that when people are uncertain about their economic future, they work harder, innovate more, and make better choices. This was supposed to be liberating. The market would reward merit, punish inefficiency, and create a natural meritocracy where opportunity flowed to those who earned it. But here's what Friedman either didn't understand or chose to ignore about human psychology. Chronic uncertainty doesn't motivate, it traumatizes. When your brain doesn't know whether you'll be able to pay rent next month, whether your job will exist next year, or whether your health insurance will cover your medical needs, it doesn't respond by becoming more creative or innovative. It responds by activating your survival system. Your amygdala takes over. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for complex thinking and long-term planning, gets hijacked by immediate threat detection. Neuroscientific research from UCLA shows that people living under conditions of economic uncertainty experience the same brain patterns as those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The constant vigilance required to navigate an unpredictable economic environment creates what researchers call chronic activation syndrome, where your nervous system never gets the signal that it's safe to relax. This isn't a character flaw or lack of resilience. This is a normal human response to an abnormal system. The genius of this mechanism is that it's self-reinforcing. The more anxious you become, the more you need the very system that's making you anxious. When you're in a constant state of fight or flight, you can't afford to question the rules of the game. You're too busy surviving to ask whether the game itself is rigged. You internalize the system's message that your anxiety is a personal failing, a lack of discipline or ambition, rather than a predictable response to systemic uncertainty. This brings us to the second mechanism, the individualization of systemic failure. Friedman's philosophy was built on the radical notion that individual choice and personal responsibility could solve virtually any economic or social problem. Government programs were unnecessary because people could and should take care of themselves. Social safety nets were counterproductive because they prevented people from learning the harsh but valuable lessons of market discipline. What this philosophy does psychologically is devastating. It takes problems that are fundamentally systemic and structural and relocates them inside individual minds as personal failures. Can't afford healthcare? You didn't work hard enough or make smart enough choices. Struggling with student debt? You should have chosen a more practical major. Living paycheck to paycheck despite working full-time? You lack financial discipline or marketable skills. This individualization of systemic failure creates what psychologists call learned helplessness on a massive scale. When people are told repeatedly that their struggles are their own fault, that they have the power to change their circumstances if only they tried harder or made better choices, and then they find themselves unable to escape those circumstances despite their best efforts. They internalize a sense of personal inadequacy that manifests as chronic anxiety and depression. Studies from Yale University show that people living in societies with high levels of economic individual experience what researchers term achievement anxiety at rates significantly higher than those in more collectively oriented systems. This isn't the healthy stress of pursuing goals. This is the chronic psychological pressure of believing that your worth as a human being depends entirely on your economic performance in a system designed to ensure that most people will struggle. The third mechanism is perhaps the most insidious, the optimization trap. Friedman believed that free markets would naturally optimize outcomes, creating the most efficient distribution of resources and opportunities. Competition would ensure that everyone was pushed to perform at their highest level, creating a society where excellence was rewarded and mediocrity was eliminated. But human beings aren't machines to be optimized. We're complex psychological creatures with needs for connection, meaning, rest, and security. When you apply optimization logic to human lives, you create what researchers call optimization anxiety, the chronic feeling that whatever you're doing, you should be doing it better, faster, more efficient. This manifests in every area of life. You should optimize your sleep for maximum productivity. You should optimize your diet for peak performance. You should optimize your relationships for networking potential. You should optimize your leisure time for skill development. You should optimize your exercise routine for maximum caloric burn. Every moment of existence becomes a potential site of improvement, which means every moment becomes a potential source of failure and anxiety. The psychological research on this is clear. People who approach life through an optimization framework experience significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout than those who accept good enough as actually good enough. But our economic system makes this impossible. In a competitive marketplace where your livelihood depends on outperforming others, good enough becomes a luxury you can't afford. This creates what I call performance anxiety disorder, where your entire sense of self-worth becomes tied to measurable outputs and competitive ranking. You're not anxious because you're lazy or undisciplined. You're anxious because you're trying to apply machine logic to human experience, and that creates an unbridgeable gap between what you think you should be and what you actually are. The fourth mechanism we need to understand is the scarcity mindset generate. Friedman's economic theories were built on the assumption that scarcity was natural and that competition for limited resources would create optimal outcomes. But scarcity in modern capitalism isn't natural, it's manufactured. We live in a world of unprecedented abundance, yet most people experience chronic scarcity anxiety. This happens through what economists call artificial scarcity. There are enough resources to meet everyone's basic needs, but the system is designed to create the psychological experience of scarcity to maintain competitive pressure. You're told there aren't enough good jobs, so you need to compete harder. You're told there isn't enough affordable housing, so you need to work longer hours. You're told there aren't enough opportunities for advancement, so you need to sacrifice more of your personal life. The psychological impact of chronic scarcity mindset is profound. Research from the University of Chicago shows that people operating under conditions of perceived scarcity experience measurable decreases in cognitive capacity. When your brain is constantly calculating resource allocation and threat assessment, you have less mental bandwidth available for creativity, problem solving, and emotional regulation. But here's the crucial insight. This scarcity is largely artificial. The anxiety you feel about not having enough, not being enough, not doing enough isn't a reflection of actual resource limitation. It's the result of a system that requires the majority of people to feel inadequate in order to maintain competitive pressure and prevent them from questioning whether the distribution of abundance is fair or rational. This leads us to the fifth mechanism, the choice overload paradox. Friedman believed that expanding choices would increase freedom and satisfaction. The more options people had in markets, the better they would be able to optimize their preferences and create lives that truly reflected their values and desires. Choice was liberation, but psychological research has consistently shown that beyond a certain point, additional choices don't increase satisfaction, they increase anxiety. When you have too many options, you experience what psychologists call choice overload and decision fatigue. Your brain becomes exhausted by the constant need to evaluate alternatives and optimize outcomes. More importantly, the expansion of choices in economic contexts often masks the reduction of choices in fundamental areas of life. You can choose from 47 different types of breakfast cereal, but you can't choose to live in a society where healthcare is guaranteed. You can choose from hundreds of streaming services, but you can't choose to work fewer hours for a living wage. You can choose from thousands of investment options, but you can't choose to opt out of an economy that requires you to gamble your retirement security on market fluctuation. This creates what I call false choice anxiety, where you're overwhelmed by trivial decisions, while the most important choices about how society should be organized are removed from democratic consideration and handed over to market forces. You feel the burden of constant choosing without experiencing the satisfaction of actual agency or control over the conditions of your life. The sixth mechanism is the social comparison engine. Friedman's competitive framework was designed to create beneficial social comparisons where people would be motivated by seeing others succeed. Competition would drive everyone to higher levels of achievement and create a rising tide that lifts all boats. But modern research on social comparison shows that competitive environments don't create motivation, they create chronic status anxiety. When your economic security depends on outperforming others, other people's success becomes a threat to your survival. Their achievements don't inspire you. They trigger your scarcity programming and activate your threat detection system. Social media has weaponized this mechanism. You're constantly exposed to curated highlights of other people's lives and achievement, creating what researchers call compare and despair syndrome. You see someone's promotion announcement and feel anxiety about your own career progress. You see someone's vacation photos and feel inadequate about your own financial situation. You see someone's productivity tips and feel guilty about your own perceived laziness. This isn't shallow vanity. This is your nervous system responding to perceived social threats in an environment where social standing directly impacts economic survival. In hunter-gatherer societies, social comparison was limited to your immediate tribe. Now you're competing with everyone on the planet, and your brain hasn't evolved to handle that level of comparative pressure. The seventh and final mechanism I want to reveal is what I call the future theft system. Friedman believed that free markets would create the best possible future outcomes by allowing present decisions to be guided by future incentives. People would invest in education, save for retirement, and make rational long-term choices because the market would reward foresight and planning. But the system actually operates by stealing your future and selling it back to you as anxiety. You're told to sacrifice your present well-being for future security, but that future security never arrives because the goalposts keep moving. You work longer hours to save for retirement, but retirement age gets pushed back. You take on debt for education to improve your earning potential, but wages remain stagnant while costs increase. You delay having children to focus on career advancement, but career advancement requires even more sacrifice. This creates what psychologists call temporal displacement anxiety, where you're never allowed to experience satisfaction in the present because you're always preparing for an uncertain future. Your entire life becomes a state of deferred gratification in service of goals that recede as you approach them. Research from MIT shows that people living in high uncertainty economic environments experience chronic activation of future-focused anxiety circuits in the brain. You're literally unable to be present because your survival depends on constantly calculating, preparing for threats that may never materialize, but feel absolutely real to your nervous system. Now, let me synthesize what we've discovered about how capitalism breeds anxiety instead of opportunity. We've identified 7 specific mechanisms: the perpetual uncertainty engine that keeps you in chronic fight or flight mode, the individualization of systemic failure that makes you blame yourself for structural problems, the optimization trap that turns your entire life into a performance metric, the scarcity mindset generator that creates artificial resource anxiety, the choice overload paradox that overwhelms you with trivial decisions while removing meaningful agency, the social comparison engine that weaponizes other people's success against your sense of security, and the future theft system that prevents you from ever experiencing present moment satisfaction. These aren't bugs in the system. These are features. An anxious population is a compliant population. People in chronic fight or flight mode don't have the psychological resources to question systemic inequalities or organize for structural change. They're too busy surviving to ask whether survival should be this difficult in a world of unprecedented abundance. The central contradiction at the heart of our economic system is this. It promises freedom while delivering cycle captivity. It promises opportunity while creating anxiety. It promises choice while removing agency over the most fundamental decisions about how we want to live. Understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward breaking free from them. When you recognize that your anxiety isn't a personal failing, but a predictable response to systemic design, you can begin to separate your sense of self-worth from your economic performance. When you understand that scarcity is largely artificial, you can begin to make decisions based on sufficiency rather than optimization. When you recognize that the choice overload is designed to exhaust your decision-making capacity, you can begin to focus on the choices that actually matter. The most important realization is this: you are not broken. The system is broken. Your anxiety is not evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence of your humanity responding normally to an inhuman set of conditions. Here's what you can do right now. Start by questioning the assumption that your worth as a person has anything to do with your economic productivity. Begin to notice when you're optimizing versus when you're actually living. Practice making good enough decisions and observe how this reduces your cognitive load. Recognize that most of your choices are artificial and focus your decision-making energy on the areas where you actually have meaningful agency. Most importantly, understand that individual solutions can only go so far. The anxiety you're experiencing is largely systemic, which means the ultimate solutions are also systemic. But by understanding how the mechanisms work, you can begin to protect your psychological well-being while working toward larger changes. The future doesn't have to be more of the same. We can choose to build economic systems that support human flourishing rather than human anxiety. We can choose abundance over artificial scarcity. We can choose cooperation over destructive competition. We can choose to measure success by well-being rather than just productivity. But first, we have to see clearly how the current system operates, how it shapes our psychological landscape, and how it convinces us that anxiety is the price of freedom. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand it, you can begin to resist it. Once you resist it, you can begin to imagine and create something better. The choice is yours. Will you continue to accept anxiety as the inevitable cost of opportunity, or will you begin to demand an economic system that actually delivers on its promises of human flourishing? Your mental health and the mental health of future generations depends on how you answer that question.